there were experiments being run on the population, not just in the UK, but globally, without our consent.
Would your professional view be that the way behavioural science was used during COVID was unethical?
Yes, it was unethical. I could no longer take pride in calling myself a behavioural scientist.
You've been lied to. You've been lied to by the media, government, and institutions. They want you to consume, obey, stay safe, stay silent. But if you're here, I know you're neither here to stay silent or asleep. Hit subscribe right now and join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/podcast to help us to beat the algorithm and make sure you don't miss the conversations that actually matter. Welcome to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. Live free and prosper. What happens when the tools of persuasion become weapons of control? Our guest today, Sinead Stringer, is a behavioural scientist and one of the few in her field to be brave enough to speak out about how behavioural science was used unethically during COVID-19 to drive mass compliance. If you've ever wondered why so many people complied without question, even when the evidence didn't stack up, then this conversation holds the key. In this episode, Sinead pulls back the curtain on how psychological tactics were used, not to inform the public, but to manipulate emotion, manufacture consent, and override democratic accountability. We talk about how fear was weaponized, how ethics were abandoned, and how language itself can become a tool for coercion. This is one of the most important and eye-opening conversations that we've ever had on the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast, and there's more. If you, like myself, are concerned that the same manipulation and propaganda tactics could be used again, and you want to learn how to guard yourself against it, we have great news. We're collaborating with Sinead on a new initiative called the Thinking Society, alongside a world-class faculty, including last week's guest, Dr. David Thunder, and communications expert, David Sherrilambos. It's designed to help you to sharpen your critical thinking, to spot manipulation tactics in real time, to constructively engage with others on divisive issues, and play your part in helping to build free and flourishing societies from the ground up without losing your mind or your relationships. So hit pause right now and go to weareelevate.org/thinking society to learn more and register your interest for what we've got coming for you. And when you've done that, come back, get settled, and get ready to discover what really happened behind the scenes during the COVID-19 response.
Sinead, behavioural science was something that was used extensively during the COVID-19 response. You were one of the few behavioural scientists in the world to challenge the use of behavioural science in the way that it was used during that period. What was the moment that you realised something wasn't quite right in terms of how this was being used to create compliance and manipulate human behaviour during the pandemic?
I definitely started noticing quite early in 2020, particularly when we went into lockdown mode for the weeks to flatten the curve, that there was definitely behavioural science being used to inform and improve the messages. And from a behavioural scientist perspective, I would expect nothing less in terms of, making sure that messaging was effective. But as the months continued and the lockdowns continued and the requirements on us as individuals became more and more authoritarian, for want of a better word, I began to see ever increasing hallmarks of behavioural science being used. And also, I think, for me, what I would call where it starts tipping into non-behavioural science, so into propaganda, and the lines between the two blurred, I think, particularly for me. And I really had to start challenging myself and my knowledge and my expectations around what behavioural science was and was not, what it should be for and should not be used for, and where, did that line between manipulation and in a propaganda type of sense stop, and where did behavioural science as an influencing, nudging for good begin? And I feel that I was not alone in that view. I'm sure there were other people as well. I think part of the challenge for behavioural scientists was at the time we were unregulated and we didn't really have our own professional body. So I'm sure there were many people who had similar concerns, but there was no real vehicle to voice that consistently or as a group. And I think that also played a part in terms of how quiet perhaps it felt from the outside. We, like any other group, during those COVID months into years, I certainly felt quite isolated, trying to find like-minded people that perhaps had a behavioural science background who thought and could see similarly to me, and had concerns in terms of what their profession was being involved with and at what level.
As someone who spent a career in behavioural science and with a deep expertise in the area, would your professional view be that the way behavioural science was used during COVID was unethical?
Yes, it was unethical for various reasons. But I mean, the primary driver is that there were experiments being run on the population, not just in the UK, but globally, worldwide, that were being run without our consent. Consent is always a challenging area for social sciences because pre-COVID, the BIT that had been created as part of the UK government under David Cameron had been running experiments and population experiments on the UK for years at that point. And most of us are probably totally unaware that we are likely to have been at least party to one of those experiments, if not more. And the general consensus that David Halpern talks about himself in his book, which I think came out 2015, so again, pre-COVID, was that ideally in a normal setting in an experiment, you ask for permission, participant gives consent, but in a social experiment, that may alter the outcome, and therefore where possible and where appropriate, you do not necessarily have to ask for consent, and therefore you have to run that experiment with a higher level of duty of care to the participants because they frankly do not know that they are being in an experiment. But I could see for me that it certainly met the criteria of an experiment. I could see that the interventions were being designed, changes of behaviour were being observed, they were being measured, there was a variable being introduced, and how we were then behaving and reacting to those variables was then being reiterated. So we would see, changing in messaging or changing in a message for a particular cohort, a particular demographic or particular age group. And that has all the markings of social experiments.
Yeah, for me personally, looking back over the last 5 years, it feels like the whole thing was an experiment. But, looking explicitly at the behavioral science side and related messaging, how did it feel as someone in the field seeing it being used unethically like that? Because for me personally, I mean, my professional background, I studied economics and advanced statistics. And the first thing that alerted me to some malpractice was the huge gap between the underlying reality when it came to the data, the statistics, and then the public narratives. And that triggered this real intense sense of lack of integrity in what was going on in the world. And it really brought something into me that wanted to speak out what I saw due to the way that there was this manipulation of narratives around the actual underlying reality. But for you, with your behavioral science lens on, how did it feel for you seeing things being used unethically at scale like that, whether or not we define it as an experiment, but at the public level scale? How did that feel for you looking back?
Well, I became incredibly frustrated. I felt that I needed to do something personally. As I said, I did reach out to a few of my cohort. I was one of very few at that point, who had actually studied behavioural science at the London School of Economics. I was only in the second cohort. So there were a finite amount of people at that point, that had that expertise. And I was really quite surprised to find that I was in a significant minority of people who were concerned, who had any concerns in terms of the ethical position. And that's more of a surprise to me on the basis that part of our training is around ethics. As a behavioural scientist, you're taught, many things, but, in terms of learning around behaviour and how behavioural science is used and its value and what it can do, it can be a very, very powerful tool. And of course, like any other powerful tool, there requires ethical understanding of that power that you may wield as a designer of an intervention. And therefore, you must be challenging yourself throughout that process about what that intervention is going to do and the consequences of that intervention. And I saw none of those kind of conversations really being had. And I think for me, there was the sadness there because I could no longer take pride in calling myself a behavioural scientist. If you look on social media and it's kind of 2020, 2021, for those that were beginning to hear about it and understand that, something, I think, people were using the phrase, psyops rather than behavioural science, but for all intents and purposes it was the same thing that was happening. It was what they were picking up on in terms of feeling manipulated, and I was very sad that my profession had been kind of co-opted in a way to be used in such a fashion that felt very really quite authoritarian. And in the early months of 2020, there was no transparency at all. So even though I could see that the hallmarks of behavioural science at play, there was no information at all in terms of how that was happening. I had my suspicions because of how the government structure was, when we moved into COVID times. But for, majority of 2020, there was an incredible lack of transparency just generally around, how that was actually being involved in terms of then what we were actually, what was being done to us as the general public. So I felt very sad. I felt very isolated because I felt like maybe it's just me. It felt for a while that it was just me, but slowly and surely I did start meeting and speaking to other people that were in either behavioural scientists themselves in other countries, in this country, but also psychologists who were beginning to speak out as well. And that, slowly emboldened me to think, well, maybe I do have a point here. Maybe, this is something that is worthy of putting my head above the parapet and querying a little bit more in a public domain than I was doing to that point, which is really amongst my friends for the majority of 2020.
Yeah, it's very challenging. I mean, I think a lot of people felt it challenging because of the specific conditions that were created in terms of the environment, the messaging environment. And perhaps we'll discuss how behavioral science maybe helped create that environment where it was very difficult for people to challenge the kind of dominant ideas and narratives that were put forth. But if we look back, I don't recall a time in my life where we were subjected to such intense, continuous messaging from the government, from the media, public health messaging, enormous amount of messaging. Even if we just look at it from a pure volume point of view, we can see there was an unprecedented level of communication from governments, media, etc. But was there a specific moment, based on what you shared, where you thought this isn't right? Was there a tipping point for you that, looking back, that made you realize that this was not being used ethically?
Well, I think for me, it wasn't one moment. It was a series of moments. And I think I was already on a bit of a journey. So ethics was the last module that we do as part of our masters. So I kind of left that course with lots of really challenging kind of ideas in my head that I'd really never spent any time thinking about before. The construct of government and the fact that, government can be, rather than just thinking of left wing, right wing, or socialist, communist, it was far more, I was on a bit of a journey in terms of kind of the concept of libertarianism and paternalism, and just, beginning to understand things in a bit more of a layered way, and where behavioural science might fit in a different context. If you're working for a paternalistic government, it's a paternalistic government are there acting almost as a parent, telling you, they know best and they're going to help you do that, versus the libertarian type of a government where, it's minimal government. What is it we have to do to keep the kind of the wheels on the bus, so to speak? And, again, your behavioural science approach is going to be very different in those organisations. And you could see that playing out just if you were looking at what was going on with the BIT in the years running up versus what was happening in the US, for example, which was quite libertarian at that, in terms of its expectation as a people of having an appetite to be nudged or not. And so I was already going on that journey of really, what does that mean? What is the role of a behavioural scientist? How is that, that is a very powerful position to be able to influence or manipulate. And again, where is that line from from influencing to manipulation. And again, coming back to this question, so when I was still at university, David Halpern, who is one of the kind of key players in the evolution of behavioural science, particularly in public policy, he was instrumental in the setting up the BIT in the Cabinet Office under David Cameron in 2010. He was also instrumental in the BIT having offices worldwide, and in the kind of period between 2010 and into the 20, I think by probably about 2020, probably 2022, there were, we saw, you can align that to growth into over 400 departments of government departments kind of globally. So the growth of behavioural science in terms of its kind of using Klaus Schwab's phraseology, penetrating the cabinets was significant. David's book shows, and anyone can pick it up. It has great examples of all of the experiments that were being run, for the public good in respect to kind of nudging behaviour from, how to persuade people, nudge people to pay tax faster and more efficiently, to debiasing recruitment processes so that people from minority groups or unrepresented groups have more opportunity to get through. And this isn't necessarily about just positive discrimination in terms of just saying, well, we're just going to kind of recruit more people that look like this. It's far more subtle than that, and it's far smarter than that in terms of just debiasing processes which may be inherently biased. So it does and can do a lot of good in terms of providing that kind of that level playing field in context and to allow us to become aware of our biases. But for me, what I started seeing kind of in the later years during COVID was that, this nudging for good, as David Halpern calls it, was actually really problematic. And for me, I was already having that journey. I was already thinking, well, if you're nudging for my good might not be your good. Or if we're nudging for good, our good might not be their good. And their good may not be their good. So who is making that decision? And that's that leaves you in a very, responsible place. And therefore comes responsibility, should, in my view, particularly with my financial regulation background, comes, a greater expectation of a duty of care, and around that a greater kind of expectation around always looking at your undertakings from an ethical lens, and also ensuring that you're governing yourself in a way that means that if there is any slight slippage or you have to realign, you can do that quickly with good feedback loops, so that happens quickly, because you could potentially harm the people that are in your kind of sphere of influence, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, looking back over the entire period, or the Great Experiment, I think the idea of unintended consequences, and I know there's many that now dispute that they're unintended, but we could extrapolate that and pull that apart extensively. Nonetheless, you mentioned that, the public were referencing this as a psyop. This is a term that I heard many times looking back. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that, people are inherently wise to when they're being sold to. If someone is being over marketed to or oversold to in a business context, in an advertising context, when you walk into a store and someone immediately comes up to you, your barriers start to go up because you feel like you're about to be sold to. People have this intrinsic, almost physical knowing that they're about to be sold to or marketed to. And in many ways, I look at behavioural science in a similar way to advertising, as it's designed to get you to think and act in a certain way. So this notion of it being a psyop during COVID, I think, was a response to people's innate response to their recognition that something wasn't right, even if they didn't have the language to put to it or the understanding.
Quick break to tell you a little bit more about the Thinking Society. It's absolutely wild to look back how these tactics were used without most people even realizing it. If you had that gut feeling that something wasn't right, but didn't know how to explain how these behavioral techniques were being used, then the Thinking Society is for you. This new 6-week workshop series will help you to sharpen your critical thinking, spot manipulation in real time, and break down the narratives without breaking down your relationships. You'll learn directly from an incredible faculty, including Sinead, Dr. David Thunder, and David Sharalambos, and together they'll equip you with the tools to think clearly in a world that is increasingly disconnected from reality and engage in courageous conversations that matter. Register now for our free workshop at weareelevate.org/thinking society. Back now to Sinead to find out exactly what is behavioral science and how is it being used to influence what people think and even how they act.
I think this would be a good point to clarify for people exactly what behavioral science is, so we can actually put a container around it, and then we can explore, how it could be used responsibly in public life. But firstly, could you help us clarify what it means? What is behavioral science? And
Yeah. So its intended use is to allow us to make the right decisions easier. Would be, I suppose, my marketing phraseology for it. Richard Thaler, who's one of the co-authors for one of the seminal books, which was Nudge, released in 2007, I believe. He talked about it being uncontroversial gains. So if there is something you want to do as an individual, or everyone can agree is in your benefit, nudging, behavioral science can be used to make that path to that outcome easier. Now, there are two main routes that behavioral scientists will generally look at. One is nudging. And so what nudging is an understanding that we process information at two levels constantly. So we have our conscious thinking, so you and I talking today and me selecting the words that I'm speaking microseconds before I'm saying them. And then we have the unconscious processing, which may be influencing the words that I'm selecting, but it's unconscious. It's a processing that I cannot access at all. I cannot know what is going on in my unconscious brain. And to give a kind of a degree of those, I mean, there's a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, again, another seminal book in the behavioral science field, if anyone's interested in reading more about this. And he talks about system 1 and system 2. I think he borrowed the idea, but it's a very good, I think, clear idea in terms of that you have your system 1 thinking and your system 2 thinking. One is very slow, ethical, it's cognitive, you're aware of it, but you might use it to kind of be making important decisions or ones that are relatively important in your day, whereas you've got the other automated processes happening all the time. And there's really good, particularly now that we have neuroscience, and as neuroscience has evolved, it's really began to show more and more how much processing our brain is doing. And so perhaps 80 to even 90% of the processing that our mind is doing on a daily basis is unconscious versus maybe the 10, 20% that we're actually using kind of in terms of our conscious thinking. And it's what's made human beings so successful. The reason that we, have, survived and we are successful and we've thrived is in part because we have been very effective at how we have developed our brains so that we can be multitasking, if you like, in terms of all of the things I'm doing to survive, which aren't necessarily automated processes like breathing, but they're actually kind of thinking, being aware of a smell, being aware of of the light, how that might affect me emotionally. Equally, I've got, the decision I need to make about, what time I'm going to go for lunch and, what emails I need to send. And so we can delegate a lot of the thinking that we've done to our unconscious processes, which is fantastic. And the but is that it makes us vulnerable to those unconscious processes being nudged, because they work on often what you call heuristics, which are mental shortcuts. So maybe stereotypes might come into that. So, it might be why you might feel more comfortable, walking down that path versus that path because of the people walking towards you. You might not be conscious that you're making decisions about that, but unconsciously you may be making a decision based on stereotypes, maybe previous experiences, which you're all processing unconsciously to go, this is going to be a safer route for me. Now, that might be true. That might be your safer route, but equally it might not be. And you may have fallen prey to stereotypes because the people are wearing hoodies or they're carrying suitcases, whatever that might be. And so it's all the baggage that comes with those heuristic processing that makes us vulnerable to being, in effect, kind of nudged or manipulated to that. And particularly kind of on emotions. So, if we feel angry, we all make very different decisions. Our risk profile is very different. Our likelihood to make certain decisions is different. So it's And behavioral science has kind of pulled that all together. It evolved from behavioral economics, which itself evolved from economics, where, there were models of economics, as you know, as an economist, where, human beings should act in terms of utility. So you give us a choice of A or B, we will make the choice of B because B means that we'll make more money. And what they found over time was that these models were failing, and they were failing because human beings are not, in kind of behavioral science terms, we're not rational. So therefore, to assume rationality meant that these models would fail. So they were trying to find and understand, well, what if the human beings aren't rational, what is it they are? And that's where the kind of looking to psychology as the field, and also kind of to organizational psychology, which was also evolving there in terms of looking at groups and organizational structures. That's kind of now evolved into what we now know as being behavioral science. And I won't go into the detail in terms of like different examples of that on the unconscious, but it's certainly, again, if anyone's interested, when in 2020, ran some campaigns for Panda, and one of them was I took a video that had been released by the NHS at the time. I don't know if anyone will remember it. It had Lenny Henry and other Black actors kind of speaking straight to camera, and it was called A Letter to the Loved Ones, and it was to persuade their ethnic group to take the vaccine. And there were various behavioral science interventions used and propaganda interventions used, and so it wasn't just behavioral science. Again, where that line is, I think is always open for discussion, and certainly in terms of the marketing that we saw during COVID. But, that was peppered throughout of behavioural science interventions to try and maximise the impact of that messaging. What was particularly interesting about that, and I think it's still up on YouTube, just kind of coming back to the comment that you made before about people intuitively feeling, that something was up in terms of being manipulated. When that came out, it was almost immediately rejected. There was, quite a big groundswell of messages on the YouTube that were negative, and I do feel, to your point, I think you're right. I think if it's like anything, but and again, different demographic, different countries may have this kind of in different places. But for us in the UK, I think there is quite a subtle feeling, and we are quite sensitive to being manipulated. And I think people felt that the messaging was inauthentic. They felt something wasn't, didn't feel right. And, that's what we saw in the messages in the YouTube.
Yeah, I want to come back to the moment, the idea that humans aren't innately rational. You look back in the last 5 years and think, well, that certainly is true. And I think it feels like the world is getting more and more irrational. But there's a famous physicist, that his name escapes me actually, but his work was very, very interesting, because he challenged the notion that humans are hardwired to gravitate towards truth. And he, through his experiments, proved that humans are actually wired towards survival. So our survival mechanism, it supersedes our ability to, it doesn't supersede our ability, but it supersedes in terms of a hierarchy of needs. Survival is a higher need than seeking truth. And I think under the conditions we saw over the last 5 years, which I'm keen to explore with you in a minute, and I know Laura Dodsworth popularized a lot of some of the things we've been talking about in her book, State of Fear. I do want to explore, under the conditions of fear and anxiety, whether we become less rational and more prone to behavioral science. But before we come to that, could you explain what a nudge is? I mean, to me, I sort of remember when I was younger, I wasn't the best with heights, and we used to go, as you imagine, teenagers, living on the coast like I was, you'd go to like do cliff jumping or jumping off the pier into the sea. And I was always nervous about it because I was not the best of swimmers at that point. And it was like literally people almost poking you, saying, "Go on, Dan, you can do it." Like, they weren't saying, "Go on, you can do it." It wasn't an encouragement. It was a jab. It felt like literally prodding at me. It sounds like trying to nudge me into actually doing it. And I did end up doing it, but it felt like that physical prod. Is it as simple as that? Obviously not necessarily in a physical sense, but in a psychological sense. Is it like that kind of tap, trying to not like literally do what it says on the tin to push you towards a certain behavior, one tap at a time?
Yeah, absolutely. Nudging can utilize multiple things that we have identified over the years, and particularly through what was great about behavioral science and what attracted me in the first place was the science element. I mean, rather than it being, or we think or we hypothesize that human beings are like this, behavioral science is, absolutely premised on the science aspect. So we will run try, experiments. We will look at behavior in experimental, ideally in the field. We will look at, how actually people will behave. We're not trying to guess. We have a hypothesis, but we will then test it. And based on that information, and that will become information for us to then use in some of the situations. However, we're also very aware that human beings are incredibly complicated, and the environment and the context will change potentially how we react. So ever just pick something up and drop it into a different setting. But in terms of the science, we're there, we will look at, I know we will look at what has an effective impact. And over the years, that has really kind of grown a significant pool of data and research so that we can pick and go, well, we think in likelihood we can access, a nudge in the direction by increasing salience or by making something attractive in terms of, the information that we're providing to it. We can make it more likely that you're going to select an option by telling you that everybody else is doing it too, or that you're in the majority, because again, the norming effect is incredibly powerful. But equally, some things which feel slightly more counterintuitive, where we have, one of the great pieces of work that was done by Kahneman and Tversky, which actually won a Nobel Prize for, which was prospect theory. And prospect theory is around the fact that we are more influenced by losses than we are by gains. And they looked at financial markets and people's behavior and saw that, in a loss-making situation, people will carry that loss far down, and they will take their profits too early. So you have this kind of unequal kind of setup in respect to, the bank will always generally win because of our human behavior. So, knowing that and having that information, you can then try and kind of, create things that will stop you from being a human being in those scenarios. But these are all things that then can be picked up and utilized to kind of go, right, okay, well, if we emphasize the potential loss here, then that's going to make people more likely to do X or Y. Or if we tell people about them, the recent things that happened in their area and make it far more salient for them, then they are more likely to do that. There are also things that we like to, being moral. So a lot of these things were kind of played out during COVID in terms of very much emphasizing the group, very much emphasizing the norm, very much emphasizing kind of the moral position, because people like to think that they are good people. So by emphasizing that this is what a good person looks like, this is what a good person will do, we are going to nudge the majority of people to do that because they see themselves quite understandably as good people. And so you see it kind of in the messaging that comes out in the marketing, in the words that were being said on a daily basis by, Boris and the medical practitioners. And you'd see it in the newspapers, you'd see it on the, media channels. The kind of language is quite similar. It was repetitive. We were kind of hearing the phrases over and over again, but the messages themselves were relatively simple. And it doesn't take a lot, particularly when you're looking at populations, to nudge the majority into, if you only have to move them in a small amount. The other thing that was very effective was what I call gradual commitment. So, you move them slightly and then you move people slightly more and then you move people slightly more. And people would generally carry on moving along. If you tried to move them from A to Z, there would be a lot of noise and a lot of resentment. But actually, you can still get them there, but you just need to take a slightly longer time. And I have to say, even, having trained as a behavioural scientist during COVID, I was shocked at how easy actually it was to change people from what I would have expected were their value systems kind of pre-COVID into what they were saying and doing and stating in the years after that. But I think, coming back to your point as to why that was so incredibly successful, I think it was like a perfect storm in respect to the science that behavioral scientists had at that point kind of poured together. We'd been running at that point as a kind of a science area within kind of 10 years. We had managed to get into most of the major governments, so we were in places of really good influence and very positively seen in terms of a tool that public policy could use really effectively. But also, and very importantly, everybody now is connected to the media. So if you think back to the kind of like the, Second World War, propaganda and media was, leaflet drops that you may or may not have been over your head if you were in a main city. Certainly you wouldn't probably got them anywhere else. You would have needed to have picked it up. You would have needed to have read it. And then maybe you listening to the radio station. Whereas nowadays, we are literally plugging ourselves in the morning. We are receiving whatever the messages are that, that we need to receive through the day. And then we're plugging, certainly during COVID, I think we certainly started, we kind of stopped relatively soon. But, we did start, going down for our kind of daily Boris, update. And again, you're just there waiting to kind of have these messages directed at you. So I think we've never experienced in history access to human beings almost on a constant flow in terms of the messaging that we are able to, in effect, kind of pump into their brains.
Wow, it's wild. It's wild to look back and see that was used. And as you were talking about the concept of gradual commitment. So again, I remember some of the memes and social posts. It's just washing your hands. It's just wearing a mask. It's just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. It's just this. It's just that. And there was this escalation of and then normalization, and then not just normalization, but moralization of policy that you talked about, the moralization. And I think that was deliberately used.
What you just heard, the gradual shift from A to Z, wrapped in morality and repetition, is a masterclass in behavioral manipulation. That's exactly why we're hosting a free workshop to help you recognize these patterns, challenge these moralized narratives, and build your own internal resistance to groupthink. It's part of a powerful new initiative we've launched called the Thinking Society, led by Sinead alongside Dr. David Thunder and David Sherrill-Embos. Head over to weareelevate.org/Thinking Society and register now. It's free to join and could change the way you see the world. Back now to Sinead to learn exactly how these behavioral techniques were used during COVID-19.
Can you recall some specific examples of nudges that you witnessed the government or public health system using during that time to help people ground their understanding of how they're applied?
Yeah, I mean, probably the most obvious one that outside the one that I did the video on was the look them in the eyes, because it was one that most people remember. It was very powerful. And again, I think it gave most people quite a visceral reaction to those videos. They were, they were in papers, they were kind of full spreads, and they were on the TV and the adverts. And they utilize a behavioral insight that had been identified and then replicated quite successfully, which was that even if so the original science was that, an example, if I remember the first one rightly, was that somebody had put a pic of kind of a big poster of just some eyes, and had put it over in front of kind of on top of an honesty box, and then just watched people's behavior. And it was found that people were more likely to leave the right amount of money in the honesty box with the poster than the honesty box without. And just the concept of being looked at changes what we do. And so that was kind of what was then picked up and used. So you see very much the kind of the eyes are looking straight at you. They're very close. So you can, it is a very much, if that was a close relative or friend, that would be the kind of the space that you'd be using. They're looking straight at you and you're being told, look them in the eyes and tell them that. So it's a very direct message. You're being given an instruction. You're more likely to comply because the eyes are looking at you. And then obviously you then got the colors and etc. and the kind of the words that are then being used. So that was kind of a clear example of where they had very successfully applied behavioral science to really effectively kind of get that message. And I think what's interesting for that and all the others really, because all of the time we had, even the when we had 3 things being said, or we had the kind of emergency signage that was going on in the background. And these are all things that we've learned over the years that are successful in really strengthening the messaging and kind of bringing it in at levels that are kind of below consciousness, which make them really kind of effective. And what's important about that is that you are what human beings are really good at is creating a narrative for themselves to explain to themselves why they think something. If I give an example of that, so I would give an example that I use sometimes, which is when we all, because it's something many of us do, where we're looking to buy a house and we look at property and we're going to go, okay, before we start, we write down a little shopping list of all these things that we absolutely have to have and all the things we might want to have. And we're absolutely adamant, we haven't had them in the last house. We're not going to make the same mistake. They're definitely what we're going to go. And we go around and we start looking at houses. And before we know it, we've fallen in love with a house that doesn't have 3 of the things on our absolute have-to list. And the reason that we really want to buy it is because it's of some attribute that actually isn't even on our list at all. And so we are very, very good at creating a narrative of why, therefore, we are now doing something which didn't make sense to our week ago self. Well, actually, I hadn't done this, and actually it's closer to the girls' school, or actually, it's closer to work, or actually the mortgage is X amount less. And these are all really rational explanations as to why we are now doing something which goes against what we felt we would be doing a week ago or a month ago. And those narratives are really, really powerful. And we internalize that position, and we are incredibly good at it. And so what was fascinating with COVID, and I think one of the reasons why perhaps some of us had quite an isolating experience, was because what was really effective was the amount of messaging that everybody was getting, particularly if they continued to watch mainstream media and they were kind of having that and the mainstream press, that message was kind of being internalized by those people. And a good example of how kind of incredibly powerful that was that there was some, and again, back to kind of some researcher called George, I want to say Lowenstein. He did some work, I think back in kind of 2015. So again, pre-COVID, where he was looking at defaults. And defaults are one of the things, again, behavioural scientists get quite excited about, because one of the other things that we might get involved with is what's called choice architecture. So for example, if you're online and you're kind of, going through a process to get to a form or to do a form, it's quite likely nowadays that has been designed, but with behavioural science in mind, to ideally to make that process easier for you to navigate, more likely to get to the points where, whatever the process is getting you to, that you can get to that process equally. It is also interesting to note that we also do design friction into those same processes. So if anyone has ever been frustrated by a process and can't understand why something has been designed so badly, it is quite possible, not totally likely, but quite possible, that rather than ineptitude, it has been designed that way to create friction and to reduce the amount of people getting to the end. So behavioural science can be used in both ways. But the work that George was looking at was around default. So they randomly assigned a default in a medical settings, and these were kind of end-of-life care pathways. So for example, do not resuscitate. We're going to default you to do not resuscitate. We're going to default you to we are going to try and resuscitate. And what was interesting is that they randomly assigned these to people, and they said, right, you're here, you're here, you're here, you're here. And then they went back and they gave these people the opportunity, told them that they were being nudged. So they literally told them, you are in an experiment and we are going to nudge you. It's warning, you're about to be nudged, which is why it's quite seminal for this conversation as well in respect to people having that consent or lack of. Because in the process of receiving that default, they had internalized that position, and that's the only way I can describe it in terms of then what happened. Then when they were given the opportunity to change their default to the other way, they chose not to for the vast majority. And that's incredibly interesting, because I would have thought perhaps my first inclination to that data was that, well, maybe these are young people that haven't really thought about end of life, and so they're more easily kind of positioned. But actually these were people who were already in some layer of kind of medical process. They were likely to be in their 60s and plus, and were also having kind of some kind of experience of some terminal or serious disease. So these were people that I would expect who'd already had some degree of thinking about, actually, what would I want to do? And yet they were still incredibly influenced by somebody just handing them a default and saying, right, if this happens to you, we're not going to resuscitate. And in the process between that and then being offered the choice to change, for me, what we're seeing is that they have internalized that to be their own decision. And that's exactly what we saw during COVID, during the processes happening through COVID. You start having conversations with your family and your friends, and you'd say, why do you think that? And it was a personal conversation at that point. It stopped being, when I saw the messages as well, I'm not sure, I don't know what to think about that. It was, no, this is what I think, this is what I believe, this is who I am. And that's why, very, very quickly, the whole conversation about what COVID was and everything associated with it became so incredibly polarized and politicized in respect that we just couldn't have certain conversations.
Wow. I mean, that internalization is fascinating, because that was my personal experience. It very much became, people's worldviews were shaped, their identity was shaped around this. They became not only a belief system, but it did become connected to who they were. And I think that is most shocking for me, in that, I know from human psychology, looking through the lens of personal development, for instance, our early belief systems as children are often influenced by repetition and intensity. So if we're exposed to an idea over and over, it becomes programmed into our mind. If it comes with intense emotional experience, then it's more likely to become a belief system. And if we then live in accordance with that belief system, it then becomes an identity level belief. And that is what I witnessed happening during COVID, is that obviously we had the repetition, day in, day out across all channels. It was almost inescapable. Even if you were not even tuning into any form of digital media, the billboards were everywhere.
Absolutely. Stay at home,
distance,
protect the NHS, save lives.
Like a mantra. It's almost became a mantra. Like unconscious people are like saying it in their minds.
A quick break again to remind you about our collaboration with Sinead, the Thinking Society, a groundbreaking new course that shows you how fear, uncertainty, and group dynamics are used to steer public opinion, and of course, how you can resist. This is more than just awareness. It's about learning how to think independently, engage respectfully, and build bridges in a divided world. Register now at weareelevate.org/Thinking Society to find out more. Now back to the conversation with Sinead.
So it's under those conditions where there is this intensity, whether manufactured or otherwise, people know my view on that one, but nonetheless, when you have people in perpetual fear and anxiety, are people more likely under those conditions to be prone to behavioral science? And secondly, and you touched on it earlier about people's personal values, it feels like people compromised on their own personal values and principles in the way that you described in that default mode, which is most shocking. So firstly, those conditions of fear, anxiety, is there evidence within the field of behavioral science that being under the conditions of fear, uncertainty, and anxiety, that people are more likely to be nudged or programmed?
Yes. Clear evidence. Just so it's one of the reasons that the ethics of what was done is such a big thing, because I certainly was trained that fear was absolute, and any of those very powerful negative emotions were absolute no-nos as far as any type of behavioral trial that I would be allowed to implement. So we are more likely to conform, we are more likely to comply. And it's not just about fear, it was more subtle than that, because yes, it was fearful, but also it was the general environment of not really knowing what was up anymore, and that was again why the value system was so easy to move, because people were kind of being decoupled, I think, from their value system, and part of that was because it was the information that was being received almost daily was totally confusing. So you think, okay, I understand, like let's use the examples of the mask. So we went through, in the UK at least, for the first few months when nobody needed to wear a mask, and it was actually the mask mandate didn't come into August of that year, where you would have thought, well, wait a minute, we are we're out of the problem now with COVID numbers have fallen dramatically. Where everyone's back outside, it's sunny, vitamin D levels are higher, no one's getting COVID. And then suddenly, the mask mandate came in. So that was a bit confusing. So again, it doesn't make sense. What's going on? Okay, well, and then it became, well, actually, it's not about, you're not protecting yourself, you're protecting others. Okay, well, And so then it was like, well, what does that mean? I don't really understand what that means. And you spend trying to just decide what that kind of meant. And then it was like, well, actually, it's not so much about the mask protecting anybody. It's really about the fact it's a sign of, responsibility. That was the phrase that we were given. It's a sign of responsibility. Whereas I personally saw it as a sign of conformity. But by that point, I'd already kind of disentangled myself from that process and was likely to kind of be the opposite of pretty much any prevailing kind of narrative that was coming out anyway. And again, as I want to make the point, just because, a group of us, experience that those months and that year, those couple of years very differently, we're no less likely to be influenced by these things. And I think that's important in terms of kind of being humble about this whole process, to constantly remind ourselves that, in the same way that, the people were kind of influenced to kind of be in the group, at one point, we would have found ourselves in that out group. So what we made the out group work for us, and we then imbued that identity onto ourselves. And that became our narrative. So we, every human being, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum or the COVID spectrum, they are as likely to be influenced in similar ways. But certainly what we saw in that was that they just kept changing the story slightly. So you couldn't really get quite a clear handle as to why am I doing this again? And then we'd have situations, so then it would be the next time it would be, well, you have to wear a mask in the restaurant. But now you only have to wear a mask in the restaurant if you walk to the table. When you sit down at the table, because somehow being lower, I don't know, is okay, you can take the mask off. But if you go to the toilet, you have to put the mask on. Except for when you're in Parliament, where if you're sitting down, you have to put the mask on. But if you stand up, you can take the mask off. And it's like, well, come on, this can't make sense to anybody. And yet you carried on seeing people, because at that point, people had lost their connection to what they understood rights and wrongs. And that was, I think, quite purposeful again. So we create a situation where we're high emotions. We've got very strong negative emotions being triggered purposefully. So we've got the fearing, we've got shame, we've got scapegoating, we've got all of those, isolation, we've got all of those things which are being kind of very much used to enhance conformity. And then we're creating an environment where nobody really knows where up is anymore. Is up, down, down is up. And therefore that pushes a far more significant reliance on the authority, because if I don't know what right is, I need someone else is going to need to tell me, and therefore that again will increase conformity and compliance to what I'm being told to do. And for me, both of those kind of activities were happening and hand in glove, and they were both happening purposely and by design.
Yeah, I mean, history has shown us that human beings really don't handle uncertainty well, and if you shake the jar to the point where people are so disorientated, where they no longer know what is left or right or up or down, it's no wonder why people then look for certainty in
Absolutely.
authority, that deference to authority that David Chernobyl talks about. So one of the things that I think we mustn't forget is that when SAGE, the government advisory group, first came together, there were more behavioral scientists on the SAGE group than there were virologists or epidemiologists. And let's not forget this was positioned as a public health threat. Yet we were assembling an advisory group that was grounded in developing compliance, and that for me is highly questionable. And I want to talk about that in a moment when it comes to ethics and the lack of ethics and what good ethical governance might look like. But when you define behavioral science, I was actually a little alarmed by the definition itself about the idea of helping people to make the right decision, and who determines what is the right decision, as you said earlier. And it felt to me across this entire period, whether it was the stay-at-home mandates or the lockdowns or the social distancing, the mask mandates or the pharmaceutical rollouts, everything was positioned as doing it for the greater good, protect your neighbor, protect your loved ones. That in itself, we know that that's a great manipulation to make people feel like they're doing it for the greater good or to help others. But I can't help but remember the scene out of Hot Fuzz, Simon Pegg's film, where they've killed a bunch of the local residents and they're all there in the kind of graveyard saying it's for the greater good. If you haven't seen it, you have to see the clip. I'll put it somewhere so you can get it. But they're all just like, man, like they're just there like hypnotized, saying it's for the greater good to justify their extreme actions. But when I look back, It looks like we were dealing with people who were hypnotized and justifying it for the greater good, just like in that kind of crazy example in the film. And I got a slam for sharing that clip several times during COVID. But to me, that's exactly what it felt like. It felt like the hijacking of the greater good. And if we look at that in the context of behavioral science, explain to me the ethics of the greater good when it comes to behavioral science, because who decides? And if you've got an organization, the SAGE group, that is heavily orientated towards behavioral science, who then makes those decisions and how are those decisions made? I'm curious to explore this with you.
Yeah, so great question. In terms of what happened in the UK, so we had, as you said, they had SAGE, which was kind of an ongoing kind of group providing independent advice to the government. And obviously we can talk probably on a whole nother podcast about what independence actually looks like, but I suggest it doesn't look like that. And then below that, there were certain subgroups, of which SPI, an unfortunate acronym, Scientific Pandemic Insights and Behavior Group, were there to provide expertise and recommendations, advice in respect to behavioral science on, how to, whatever they were received. So basically, if they were being asked, well, how do we get people to stay indoors, then this team would provide, again, advice in terms of interventions that could be applied that might improve advice. That information then went from advice from SPI to SAGE. SAGE then provided recommendations. So in the SAGE, there was an expectation that was where the medical so that's where witty, etc. would have also been. And so the kind of behavioral science insights, maybe some other insights in terms of social impacts as well. Then the medical impacts would then provide their summary of what they think. And that then again was still advice that would then be presented up to Boris and ultimately the Cabinet Office. I don't think many MPs outside the Cabinet Office were involved, is my understanding. It was very much with the ministers. And that would also be reflected in what David Halpin wrote in his book, which was Inside the Nudge Unit, where he says very clearly in his book that the interventions that were signed off by the minister. So in terms of accountability of those activities, it would have been with the government. And that for me is again part of the challenge and the issue that I have with what happened and how it happened, and which is just a whole around that whole governance structure, which for me allowed a diffusion of responsibilities. It separated what would inherently be the behavioural scientist's role of accountability of not only the intervention design, but also the experimental process. The kind of what you would expect to be kind of managed as part of any experiment, and very importantly from an ethical perspective, you would have kind of a duty of care to the people that are being involved in that experiment. We have what's called the kind of precautionary principle, which is that our expectation, like with medical experiments, to the expectation to do no harm, and that if harm is being done, that we need to be very alert to unintended consequences, not just the harm that may be being done directly in terms of the intervention, but things that may be happening that may then provide harm, emotional or physical, to either one or a group of people. And that kind of that duty of care is generally expected to be with the designer, the person who is kind of managing that experiment. What we saw, however, in the UK, and I'm sure other countries were exactly the same, is this kind of segregated process, which meant that, we had people down at the bottom kind of providing their expertise and their insights, who maybe were getting one part of that information, maybe not even, getting the full information from the scientific literature. And therefore, really, they were not able at that point to necessarily make the right intervention recommendations. If, for example, and as part of my research into this area, and with the assistance of AI, I ran some of the experiments through what kind of known ethical frameworks. So the APA, which is the American Psychologists, and we've got the BPA as well, the British kind of Psychology Association. So they've got ethical frameworks, and when you run those through and say, well, would these things have met the criteria for an ethical experiment? And the responses are slightly mixed, but generally it comes out in favor of there was a few weaknesses here, but generally yes, okay. However, that is on the kind of premise that those interventions were not harmful. When you then ask AI to recalibrate based on and give it more information to. So, for example, say, well, this information actually is based on 8 weeks of trial data based on a subset. I want you to go and research that. I want you to go and source that data first. I want you to look at what the information that was in the public domain at that point, and then do the same assessment. At that point, feels like a behavioural science intervention moves into propaganda, because it's then, this is a narrative that we need to nudge, we need to manipulate, because the kind of the difference really that I've come to understand between a behavioural science intervention and propaganda is very much based on the harm of the output. If you have a clear narrative that you want to check, you want to send, regardless of its impact to that person, then that's propaganda. If you are trying to nudge somebody in the direction of good, then it feels, it has an ethical standing. But as soon as the nudging to a position is different and is no longer good for that person, then it no longer becomes, or its ethical position kind of falls away. And at that point, it is in effect propaganda. And so that's by kind of going through that process and understanding that if I was a behavioural scientist sitting in SPI-B, I don't know how much medical information they would have received. I have no, I expect what we would have seen is, well, that's for the medical people to decide. I just need you to kind of provide information on, if this was the case, how would we nudge people to do this? How would we, increase conformity? How would we increase compliance? And therefore, this kind of separation of responsibilities allows things to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. And I don't want to, I know it's always a bit sensitive to refer back to World War II, but for me, the pattern of behaviour is very similar to obviously what we heard during the Nuremberg trials, which was that I was just doing my job. And we can see, Ryan talks about the kind of banality of evil, that, it was ordinary people doing what they perceive to be ordinary jobs, but actually the kind of the all in the round, great evils were allowed to happen. And it feels to me this separation of kind of responsibility and accountability from the person providing the kind of the concept of the insight and the intervention, then going through these layers of other groups before it comes to the minister, is ripe for bad things being done by good people. And that was certainly my feeling at the time as we started getting more information out from SPI-B. The minutes started coming out later in 2020 that, the likelihood was that something of that ilk was happening.
Do you think that justifies what happens, the diffusion responsibility, and who ultimately should be accountable for that diffusion responsibility, recognizing, what you alluded to at the beginning about what would look like an ethical set of standards for such an experiment? Do you think that is a just reasonable? Yeah.
Absolutely not. So I think one of the things that we were generally told, and again to take as a given during COVID, was that it was an emergency, and therefore in emergency situations, certain activities will just need to be set aside. So democracy set aside, voting set aside, all of the normal kind of tools for a democratic process, for challenge, etc. And this would be, I perceive, kind of no different in terms of this expectation and almost an understanding, well, we're in a state of emergency, and therefore, we have to be able to move very quickly and make decisions that we wouldn't normally make. But for me, again, because I come from, for the last few years, I've particularly focused on governance in financial regulation space. Where governance really shows its power and where it's absolutely critical is in situations where people need to make fast decisions, where people maybe need to make risk-based decisions. And so this is not the time where you stand down your governance. It's where you really need to know that your governance is going to be there to protect not just the people, not just us as kind of unknowing participants in the experiments, but actually all the people involved. If I am the behavioural scientist at the kind of the bottom of that process, providing advice, then, and somebody comes back and a COVID inquiry, for example, a few years down the line, I would want for me to be able to say, I was provided this information on the basis of this information that I was given. I asked for this information, it wasn't provided. And I caveated the information I provided and made it conditional based on X, Y, and Z. And that I can have that documented as evidence of what I did and didn't do. And similarly, if I am the top person, if I am that minister and I'm being said, like, you are the accountable person, you need to be held to account for those decisions, well, then I want to be able to evidence that the information that I had at the time, meant that decision was appropriate. And other information which maybe had been available but hadn't got to me because the governance framework wasn't in place or wasn't working efficiently in terms of that feedback loop, that I wasn't receiving the information that I should have had to have maybe altered my decision, modified my decision, or stood down my decision, because that would, again, protect me. So governance works for everybody. It's not kind of an admin exercise that happens after the event. It's something that should be, as a risk-based tool, should be absolutely embedded into important decision-making processes. And this is, I think, in terms of the people that were affected by this, was incredibly important. And let me be clear, harms were done. People were harmed by the interventions that were submitted by the government during those years. And therefore, on that basis alone, the duty of care is non-existent. And again, if you look to the BPA or the APA in terms of their expectations around a governance framework, you have a duty of care to your participants for as long as the effects of the experiment that you ran on them takes place. And what we can see is that clearly hasn't happened. And SPI-B was stood down in 2022. So those people that literally does not exist anymore. And as we know, in terms of the role of government, those ministers are no longer in power. They're certainly, they may not even be MPs anymore. And so, it's the duty of care is lost. It's gone in the ether, and that can't be allowed to happen in the future. It must be a far more robust process that is prepared to have humility in the interventions that it puts in place, and to have really strong governance, ethical governance, to manage, monitor, identify, and mitigate any of the unintended consequences and intentional consequences of the implementations that it may put in place.
Despite that diffusion of governance and responsibility, is there any actual evidence that SPI-B or other parts of the SAGE or government or advisory boards actually had behavioural science ethical guidelines in place? Have you been able to establish whether there was a series of ethical guidelines?
No, I've not been able to see any. They put in place a terms of reference, but that was again toward the end of 2020. But it talks mainly around there are some kind of high level kind of expectations, but mainly around the fact that they are providing advice and not, being responsible for what is, being potentially then recommended up to the politicians. And again, that would be months and months in at that point as well. So it evolved, and in part because there was some quite public vocal questioning, which is why in the first place they actually then started documenting and publishing their minutes as well. So that was on the back of the public queries around what was actually happening. What's most disappointing is that actually a lot of this was already known. So back in 2010, there was a select committee in the House of Lords to look at behavioural interventions. I think probably because the BIT was created at that point as part of the Cabinet Office, and they wanted to ensure that in terms of its influence, it had, they looked at how it was going to be used, and they talked about the fact that behavioural insights should be used proportionally to what was being changed. They also talked about accountability, and they also looked at transparency and said that, whatever was being done needed to be transparent, needed to be communicated. And so it's incredibly disappointing that those things were not then already in place, and then certainly that they weren't then evoked when we went into emergency mode for COVID and spun up the SPI-B that was specifically looking at behavioural change.
Yeah, it's very clear that there's been some significant institutional failings and ethical failings across the board. And that's abundantly clear now looking back. And, there were people like myself and yourself and others who at that time, when we eventually found each other, were able to dissect what was happening. But what do you say to someone, despite everything we've just talked about, who looks back and doesn't believe that we were manipulated, coerced and nudged during that time? What would you say to someone who doesn't see that?
It's really hard because, as I said, they will have lightly internalized all of their positions, all of what they felt, what they said. And for all intents and purposes, that is them. People don't take kindly in any situation, but certainly nothing as large as COVID, to being told that they are manipulatable, if that's a real word. But, so it's a very hard message to share and to communicate with anybody, because people understand. I think most people accept that, human beings can be manipulated, but generally not them. And so, again, kind of a key lesson for any behavioural scientist is that is the position that you go. And so it's really about trying to show that that is actually what's happened. And the best way that I found to do that, albeit it's slow because you have to have real communication and real conversations with people. I think that's it's not an easy thing to kind of orchestrate in a big behavioural science nudge, is to show and talk about examples that are outside COVID. So parallel processes or parallel situations where, you can talk on a principles or a values base, and you can see that you are aligned, and then to show the kind of the different position that was taken during COVID. But there is no simple way, in my experience at least, in terms of having those conversations.
Absolutely. Now, I know, you and I have got a project we're working on together in collaboration with your organization, the Thinking Society, with our Elevate organization. And we'll talk about that as we close in a moment. And within that, we are going to look at that difficult conversation, when we're in these environments and we have different views, and how we can navigate and orientate ourselves around those discussions. And that's going to be a big part of the program that we're putting together. Given everything we've talked about and the use of nudging in behavioral science, what are some of the simple tips you would offer to people in terms of how to spot some of these tools of behavioral science objectively? Can people develop an immunity to it? Can they start to see through it? What are some of the simple things you would offer to people that can help them to identify when these tools are being used?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing, in my opinion, ultimately, is to be literate. So to know what a behavioural nudge looks like, what the kind of classic propaganda / messaging can look like, so that you can see it and you can understand what it is and why it's perhaps triggering you emotionally. And then because it's all about, and this is my campaigns when I was doing the campaigns back in 2021 for Panda, were about nudging people into cognition, into thinking with their kind of, their slow cognition brain. So actually, rather than something happening automatically, becoming aware of it because you have become literate in being able to identify those things, and then forcing yourself to use your system to think about what it is. Why do I think this? Why do I feel this? Do I think this? And to be able to expand on that. Well, if I think this, and if I extrapolate that out into other scenarios, do I still think that? And it's about really beginning to understand who you are, what you actually think, what your principles are, so that you can, get I suppose, a more powerful base in terms of what you actually think. The challenge with any type of behavioural science is because it is unconscious. They do slip through the net, so it's hard and it's effortful. But until you actually start becoming aware of them, that there's nothing that's particularly easy. Laura Dodsworth and Patrick Fagan wrote a great book, that provided some kind of insight in terms of activities that you could do to try and unbias yourself or unblock yourself with those. But for me, the first step and the most important step is just to become literate about what that looks like. And it's not just the behavioural science kind of nudges per se, but it's all the other things that happen. So understanding logical fallacies, understanding presuppositions, so that you can understand the language that's, either you're reading on social media or the conversations that you're having, so that you can be better at navigating your way through those conversations, so that so again, they're more positive, and you are not falling for the traps that are there because your unconscious processes wants to move on and think about something else.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is a good opportunity to talk about the thinking society and how this can help people because, as we alluded to earlier, there was this intuitive sense that something wasn't right. People could sense there was a psychological operation, which encompasses the use of behavioral science and other tools. But even to zoom back to understand some things you've talked about, how our thoughts are actually constructed and how our belief systems are constructed, and understand how those thoughts are shaped by media, institutions, culture, upbringing, etc., and be able to sharpen our critical faculties to be able to discern truth from manipulation. Because really, I think there is this, it's great that people have that intuitive awareness, but then you can put some frameworks around it to truly understand what's happening, which can help people to break free from that kind of conformist thinking and groupthink that we witnessed during, and mass formation that we witnessed during COVID, and start to explore alternatives. Because if there are systemic weaknesses that we touched on today, then we need to be able to understand what those systemic alternatives could look like to prevent this in the future, but also to form communities of free thinkers who can create group sense making, because sense making together in a truly constructed manner enables us to test our own biases and our own groupthink and break down some of those patterns. So tell us a little bit about what inspired the Thinking Society and what it is that we're putting together to help people with this type of conversation that we've been having today.
Yeah, thank you. I guess there was probably a few conversations I was having with friends and strangers online, and I became aware that there was a lot of cognitive biases in terms of play, in terms of the conversation, that people were dealing very emotionally, particularly during the kind of Trump inauguration. And that was I kind of dived into some groups where I perhaps wouldn't be my natural habitat, shall we say, because I really wanted to kind of communicate and really struggled. And what I found was that almost everybody was just dealing on pure emotion. And what I had identified, what I'd seen, and what's becoming really palpable to me was that in social media world, we are doing a few things. One of which is that we are kind of very, very emotional, and that means that we're very polarized. We are very black and white. You're good, you're bad, you're with me, you're against me, and that's that is not a good place for anybody to be. If we are all to live together as in some sort of society. And that also people weren't articulate again in terms of understanding don't go down that path, don't have that conversation with that person because, they're creating a straw man. The actual conversation you need to be having is this. And so it's about, I wanted to kind of create, and I've been thinking about critical thinking for quite a long time, and started doing some work on creating a series of programs actually for kind of young adults and teenagers, particularly because my children are that age, what critical thinking is, because I think more and more now schools and education is about teaching children stuff, but not teaching them how to think. And I really wanted to kind of provide something for that. And then speaking to a couple of my colleagues who I've done work with before, so David Chalalambous, who I know you know, and who's spoken multiple times on this podcast, and also David Thunder, who I'd done some work with a couple of years back. And it was very timely because David had just launched his book, and he was talking about, what society should look like in the future, and, how we can all flourish. And I just love this concept of flourishing. And so I really wanted to kind of have a way of working, considering as an individual who wants free speech and wants to be able to and sees the power of words and language and articulation, how do I weave that into what does a flourishing society look like? And the more we talked with David, it was around, well, you can't have a flourishing society without people who are engaged, and we can't be engaged until we are thinking. And so how do we get people to think? And it doesn't matter if they agree with us or disagree with us, because if we're all human beings and we're all trying to drive that train to a flourishing society, well, then we'll all get there. And we don't have to all agree, and that's okay. And that's one of the other things that I feel has been lost over the last few years, particularly as we've kind of driven our conversations into social media. These would have been conversations. No, I've lost friendships with people that I feel the loss of, because we have a difference of opinion, which saddens me even the more. When did that happen? Could we not find? Well, actually, you don't have to agree with me on A, B, or C, but I can still see you as a human being. So we're trying to reconnect with that through the workshop. So we start with the building bricks again of language, and I take us back on one of the workshops back to the Greeks and about what is rational thinking. How did the Greeks define it? How did they structure their kind of exercises, if you like, to really develop that? Because it's like anything else, if you don't use it, you don't have it, or you lose it. And then about behavioral science and about what that looks like, so that you can really identify it and become aware of it and separate it from your thinking. And then we kind of evolve into David's world of what flourishing societies look like, what does a community look like, and what's happening now in terms of the current society, certainly in the Western civilizations, and perhaps the pain that it's going through because it doesn't fit what we need it to, and how can we as active, engaged human beings or take it into a better direction. So we're really hoping it gives people a place and a space to take themselves away from social media and reacting all the time, to actually have an opportunity to go, well, what do I think? Do I agree with these people? And each workshop, we're kind of making time as well for people to ask questions and be engaged and be part of that conversation. I'm hoping that we can then use what comes up in each of those sessions to inform the next session, so that it becomes a bit of an evolution, so that we kind of we move through those workshops together as a group.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an exciting proposition, and people are regularly asking me, what can we do to make a difference in this time? What can we do to tackle what's happening? What can we do to push back or resist or move forward? And I think what you've put together, when I first heard about it, not only the combination of your work and Dr. David Thunder, who was on the show last week. So if you're interested in David's model of the world, when he's with his book, The Polycentric Republic, we actually did a long deep dive into that last week. So do check that out as well. And David Charalambos, as you mentioned, has been on the show many times and helped us not only understand some of the psychological processes, but also really the essence of how we have difficult conversations and how we reach people through this. And when I heard about this combination, and you kindly invited us to share this, I said, I want to go beyond that. This is so essential. I want to partner with you on this and bring this out into the world, because it not only answers the question, what can we do, which to me is the societal level piece, but it also answers, what can I do? And I think that's so important, because if we keep externalizing the problem to someone else, then we don't move anywhere. So this gives us the power internally to develop greater clarity, to hone our critical thinking skills, tools to spot these kind of behavioral tools and manipulation, stay grounded in amongst all of that, develop a personal practice that can help us make sense of the world, but also start to understand some of those frameworks for what a flourishing community or society or governance structure could look like, so we can actually pursue those alternatives and help shape them and discuss them. But ultimately, it's a lonely existence when you're questioning the narratives, and it's so divisive and polarized. So we wanted to build a community of people to come together and be able to explore these things in a group setting. So I'm really excited for what we've put together. And we've got a free workshop coming up, Sinead, to help people deeper on what we've discussed here and make sense of some of the things that we've talked about, a real practical session that people can actually get takeaways from. But at the end of that, there's going to be an invitation to come and join you as part of this educational, experiential 6-week process through the course that you developed alongside David, both of David. So for those of you interested at home, firstly, I think this is probably one of the most essential trainings that is going to be out there at this moment in time, with 3 of the most educated and wise people with the matter that we've talked about today. So if you're interested in participating in that free session, then please go to weareelevate.org/thinking society. That's weareelevate.org/thinking society. You'll find that in the description, and you'll see it popping up on the screen right now if you're watching this on YouTube, but you'll also see it in the description on Spotify, etc. And please do register for that, the free session. And you'll learn also about the course and the proposition that Sinead has outlined. But also, secondly to that, please share this. If you have been around other people who have been questioning the narrative, or even if they haven't, quite frankly, this is a real opportunity to actually build across divides, if you will, and help everyone to develop the skills to navigate this crazy time that we're in, this mad world that I think we're navigating, this transitionary or transformative moment in history. So I encourage you to go to weareelevate.org/thinking society, enter your name and email, and you'll get the latest details about the workshop and the program that's coming up. Sinead, I want to close out by asking you a couple of questions. What is the one thing you'd like people to remember from today's discussion?
That behavioural science is not going anywhere. It's fully embedded in the governments of the world. It has a part to play to make things easier for us to do what we want to do, but it carries a burden with it that the governments are not currently taking seriously enough in respect to the governance. And I am always thinking, reminding myself of the phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so until and as when governments take that responsibility on themselves, we as citizens of those countries need to take that responsibility for ourselves.
Thank you. And what's your hope for the thinking society and what you're assembling?
I really want to, help empower people to have conversations. I think people are desperate to communicate with each other and perhaps people in a more meaningful way. And I think part of that is around being articulate and understanding language in a way that we seem to have lost, and to be able to navigate challenging conversations that might feel confrontational, and to be able to, have those and understand in a far wider way why the importance of freedom of speech is so critically important, and why ultimately we have to stand up and be counted in that regard if we want the societies for our children and for their children to allow them capacity to flourish.
Wow, that's incredible. And for me, when I started making sense of what's happening in the world, it does fracture. It creates challenging situations for our relationships. When we're on different sides of the aisle, if you will, on any matter, whether that's politically or even just the concepts that we've been dealing with in the last few years. So what I'm looking forward to is learning more about how to make sense of the world without losing my mind and feeling a sense of perpetual anxiety as I navigate this complex system, but also how to do it without losing relationships. And in fact, rather than losing relationships, how we can actually strengthen them by having courageous conversations in ways that help us all understand each other better and the world that we're navigating. So I'm really excited for the webinar that we've got coming up and the proposition that we're developing. So once again, a recap, go to weareelevate.org/thinking society to sign up on that one. Sinead, this has been a truly fascinating and insightful conversation, and I feel deeply privileged to be able to meet with someone like yourself who has the domain expertise that you do in the field of behavioral science, one of the few in the world who's applied it critically in what we've seen here today. So firstly, I want to honor the courage that you've had in doing that and stepping out when so few have done so, but also now creating the environment where people can enter into this discussion in a respectful way and actually do it in pursuit of something greater, which is a flourishing and free society that enables us all to live a great life. So thank you so much for our time today, but more broadly for the work you're doing in the world beyond this. So any parting messages before we close out today?
No, just I hope, people will join us. And as I said, as you say, it really doesn't matter which side of any aisle they are on. In fact, I'd like to think the people that will be interested in joining are those that are, willing and be challenged. And that stands for all of us. Humility and boldness are really key characteristics, which I think if we all put those at the forefront of who we are and what we do, then the world would be a place than it is now. So I welcome everybody who wants to join. I hope we make it a place that everyone would feel welcome, and look forward to speaking with hopefully many of you there.
Thank you, Sinead. And once again, that's weareelevate.org/thinking society to join up for the free session that we've got coming up very shortly. And then beyond that, the 6-part course as well, which may include some exciting bonus special guests. Look out for that as well. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Now, please do share this episode. So many people, no one went unaffected by the last 5 years. We all got affected in different ways, but I know our audience here on this podcast have seen the world differently to many others. And we've started to understand the different frameworks that we can navigate this time with, and what Sinead has offered today is a new lens that we can examine what happened in the last 5 years, but not just only what happened, but what's happening and what could happen again in the future. So please do hit that share button. And if you valued this conversation, hit that subscribe button as well to make sure you get notified for our very next episode. And if you haven't already checked it out, do check out our episode with Dave Thunder last week as well for his view on this very same situation that we've been discussing here today. So thank you again, Sinead, and thank you to everyone at home who's listened all the way to the end here. What a great conversation. And we'll see you again very soon on the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast.
Thank you.
What we explored today isn't just history, it's a preview. The same behavioural tools that we used to drive compliance during COVID-19 have not gone away. The systems are still in place, the tactics are still being normalised, and the next wave of manufactured consent may just be around the corner under a different name, under a different crisis, a different narrative, and we can't afford to sleepwalk into it. So if this conversation stirred something in you, don't just listen, it's time to act. That's exactly why we created the Thinking Society, to make sure that you're not left unprepared, so you can spot manipulation in real time, stay grounded when the world is spinning, and engage with others even on the toughest topics without losing your mind or your relationships. You'll be learning from a world-class faculty, including Sinead, Dr. David Thunder, and David Sherrill-Lambos, to help you sharpen your critical thinking, decode the tactics being used, and play your part in building free and flourishing societies from the ground up. So here's your next step. Go to weareelevate.org/thinking society and sign up for the free session that we've got coming up. It's your invitation to be part of something powerful. And if you want to go deeper, you'll get early access to the full 6-part course, plus some exciting special guests that we've got lined up. And finally, if this episode hit home, then please do share it. Many people are still trying to make sense of what went on over the last few years, and this episode is potentially the missing piece. So hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you haven't already, make sure you check out last week's episode with Dr. David Thunder, another vital piece of the puzzle. Until next time, stay awake, stay grounded, and live free and prosper.